This is Ken Davis's Christmas Send-Off, a Wyldhaven Christmas novella, written by Lynnette Bonner, narrated by Amy Lilly. Chapter 1. Ken Davis woke on Christmas morning with a pickaxe of pain beating at the inside of his skull. He moaned and rolled over onto something hard and cold. He pushed back and pried one eye open. An empty, brown, embossed glass whiskey bottle lay on the bed beside him. The cork sat on the nightstand that stood between his and Tommy's beds. Ken grunted and reached for it, but just that little movement made the room sway like a bow in a storm. He changed course, flopped back to his pillow, and clutched his head instead. And what was that weight pinning his foot beneath the covers? He pushed at it to give his feet more room, but it didn't budge. He lifted his head. Allegra, the black and white puppy Aurora had given to PC as a Christmas present yesterday, lay at the foot of his bed watching him. Her tail thumped up and down a few times, but other than that, she didn't move. He dropped his head back to the pillow. "Allegra, bad girl, get down." There was no force to the words, however, and the puppy knew it. She didn't budge. PC had consigned her to a crate in the living room, but Ken had a vague recollection of hauling her up onto the bed in the middle of the night because she had wandered into their room and wouldn't quit whimpering. From across the room, Tommy giggled. "Allegra likes to sleep on your bed." "Yeah." Ken squeezed thumb and fingers to his temples. PC not gonna like that bottle." Remembering the cork, Ken fumbled a hand for it without looking. A fist pounded on the door, sending a railroad spike through Ken's temples. "Merry Christmas, boys," Parson Clay called loudly. "Breakfast will be ready in 5 minutes." Right. It was Christmas Day, and Zoe had organized that blasted going-away party for him later this afternoon. He really needed to say something to the parson before then. He hadn't even told him he was leaving yet. "I like breakfast." Ken could hear Tommy scrambling out of bed and into his clothes. Even the puppy gave a yap and jumped down from his bed. He heard its claws scritching across the boards of the wood floor, and then, in the next instant, a sound like tinkling water filled the room. "Uh-oh," Tommy exclaimed. "PC's not gonna like that either." With a knot of frustration in his stomach, Ken lifted his head. Sure enough, the puppy had relieved herself just to one side of their bedroom door. His lip curled. If that's her way of saying Merry Christmas, I hope she figures out a different way by this time next year. Tommy laughed uproariously and slapped his thigh. You funny, Ken." Ken willed himself to push past the pain and swung his legs over the edge of the bed. He would have to clean that up, but for the moment he couldn't bring himself to move. All he had the gumption to do was cradle his head in his hands. "I'll clean it, Tommy. Just go out carefully so you don't step in it." Ken sat very still as the door creaked open and Tommy and the puppy left. From the nausea that roiled every time he moved, he might be cleaning up more than puppy leavings by the time he was through. Why did he do this to himself? He heard movement by the door and glanced up. Parson Clay stood in the frame, hands propped on either side. He swept Ken with a disappointed glance and then dropped his focus to the floor. "Tommy, bring me that puppy." Ken didn't move all through the parson's scolding of the puppy, his putting it outside on the rope he had tied off to the front step yesterday, and the commotion that went on as PC had Tommy help him clean up the puddle. Though he had planned to do it, in his current state, he was thankful that the parson had stepped in. He was also thankful that the puppy had jumped off his bed before offering her little Christmas surprise. The smell of the lye soap that the parson liked to use to scrub the floors was pungent, yet it had the smell of home about it. Ken frowned. Had he come to think of this place as home? It certainly had been a better home for him than what Pa had provided after Ma's death. Ever since PC took him in, he'd had a warm bed and a full belly. PC never said a word the whole time he cleaned and scrubbed the floor. Ken was still sitting on the edge of his bed with his head in his hands when he heard PC's distinctive footsteps approach and stop before him. Ken winced against the light as he looked up. PC stood with his hands on his hips, giving Ken that particular look he had whenever Ken had disobeyed one of his rules. "I've tried to help you, Ken. Given you truth. Given you the only answer there is to a happy life. But you keep throwing it all away." PC gripped the back of his neck, looking sorry to have to say his next words. "We can't keep doing things the way we've been doing them." Ken felt his guilt slam home. PC was right. The man had done more for him than anybody had since Ma's death when he was 12. "I've got Tommy to think of now, too," PC continued. "He looks up to you, and the example you're setting for him isn't one I can let slide." Ken lifted the empty whiskey bottle from beside his pillow and set it on the bedside table. "You're right. And that's something I've been meaning to talk to you about." He worked his jaw back and forth, trying to come up with the right words. He'd been planning to move to Seattle for months now, but the truth was, now that it came down to it, he glanced at the whiskey bottle. Living with the parson at least made him exercise some restraint. If he headed out on his own and went to Seattle, would he degenerate into the man Pa had been at the end? Ken swallowed, suddenly realizing that was exactly what had been holding him back from making the announcement to PC. Sure, he'd mentioned his plans here and there to a few of his friends, but it was different to say those same words to this man who had essentially raised him for the past several years. The man who always made it so clear that Ken could do better. The man who'd never condoned, but always forgiven. "What's that?" The parson's question made him realize he had never finished his thought. Outside, the puppy yapped to be let back in, and in the main room, Ken heard Tommy open the front door and coo softly to the puppy. Ken fiddled with the top edge of his blanket. "I'm leaving. Moving to Seattle." The brief flick of a glance he raised showed the parson's teeth clamped and a bit of a flinty look in his green eyes. "I heard about the party. Wondered if you were even going to tell me. When are you planning on leaving?" Ken felt his shirt pocket. He'd fallen into bed fully clothed the night before. Sure enough, his ticket was still there. "I leave tomorrow. Bought my seat on the train yesterday." The parson roughed a hand through his hair, leaving several sections poking up at odd angles. "Right. Well, it's Christmas. You better come out and get some of my Christmas sausage pie. Then I have presents for you and Tommy." Without another word, he spun on his heel and stalked away. Ken scrunched his eyes shut. He'd done it. There would be no getting out of this now, especially considering the parson seemed like he was through putting up with his drinking. Ken flopped back onto the bed, but he only laid there for a couple seconds before the call of nature pressed for his attention. He sat up and scrubbed a hand over his face. Whoo-wee! He could really stand some time with his toothbrush, too. Chapter 2. After breakfast, PC declared that the dishes could soak in the sink for a few minutes. He took the chair by the fireplace and urged Ken and Tommy to sit on the settee. But Ken knew what came next, and he had presents of his own to retrieve. He motioned for PC to give him a moment and then stepped into his room. From the bottom of his clothing chest, he withdrew 2 packages, one larger and heavier than the other, then returned to the main room and took his seat next to Tommy. This year, there was no tree, mostly because PC had been so sick and had only recuperated a couple of days ago, and because Ken hadn't thought of it. But neither he nor PC needed a tree, and Tommy didn't seem to miss it either. Had the poor simple-minded man ever had a tree on Christmas? They didn't know much about how Tommy was raised. He'd come to live with them when the outlaw gang he lived with had all been arrested. Ken rubbed his palms down his denims. He should have thought of getting a tree. Tommy ought to have a tree. PC cleared his throat and lifted his big brown Bible. Like he'd done every Christmas since Ken came to live with him, he read the Christmas story from the book of Luke. Ken listened, but just like always, he found the story a bit implausible. Sure, the parson believed it was all true, and Kin had sat through enough sermons to understand the gist of the message conveyed. He believed in God, he really did. And he believed God had plans for good men like the parson, Sheriff Reagan, Marshal Zane, Deputy Joe, or even simple-minded Tommy. But God didn't need a wash-out failure of a fellow like him. The parson had preached a sermon not long ago about how the Bible declared that Moses and Abraham were both called friends of God, and how every person could be too. But Kin had no doubt in his mind. He was no friend of God. He doubted that the good Lord even knew who he was, except maybe to mark down another checkmark in the failed column next to his name. PC snapped the Bible shut, and Kin realized his mind had wandered. Beside him, Tommy rocked in excitement, hands pressed together between his knees. "Baby Jesus was born on Christmas." The parson smiled softly at him. "That's right. He was, Tommy. And why was he born?" Tommy thought for a moment. "To die, so our bad stuff don't count." PC nodded. "That's right, Tommy. Anytime you do something you know you shouldn't, all you have to do is ask God and he will forgive you." "Tommy, pray." "That's right. And praying is just talking to God, like you're talking to me right now." The parson grazed Kin with a glance. He pressed his lips together and fiddled with the string tied around his top package. He was no fool. He could tell when PC was really speaking to him, even though the words were directed at Tommy. Prayer might be good for some people, but he was tough enough to make it on his own. "We get presents now?" Tommy grinned hopefully. PC chuckled and teased, "Presents? What presents?" Tommy wasn't fooled. He laughed. Those ones in the brown paper." Even Kin couldn't withhold a smile. The parson looked over at him. "What do you think, Kin? Should we open presents now or later when we get back from the Callahans?" Kin rubbed his chin, pretending to be deep in thought. Beside him, Tommy laughed all the more. He pounded his fists on his knees. "Now!" Kin ignored the throbbing in his skull and shrugged one shoulder. "I think Tommy's vote counts for more than yours or mine. I guess we have to do it now." PC nodded. "Seems so." "Yay!" Tommy thrust his hands in the air. PC reached for the smaller of the two packages by his side. He handed it to Tommy. "All right, Tom, open this one." Tommy gleefully tore into the paper without bothering to untie the string. Inside was a wooden box with a couple of drawers. The top lid of the box was hinged along the back edge. At first, Tommy looked perplexed, but then he lifted the lid. "Paints!" he exclaimed, dropping the lid back into place and clutching the package to his chest like a toddler hugging a kitten. Kin grinned. He was glad he and PC had agreed together on what they should get Tommy. He lifted his package for Tommy. "And this is for you, too." "Another?" Tommy tossed his set of paints down on the settee next to him and snatched the package Kin held out. The paper on this package didn't last any longer than the other. "Papers!" Helping him finger one of the pages, Kin said, "It's special heavy paper so you can paint on it." "I love it." Tommy suddenly had tears in his eyes. "I ain't never got no presents on Christmas before." Kin felt his jaw grow slack. He exchanged a look with PC, wishing he had spent more money to get Tommy a few more presents. PC seemed just as taken aback. Silence hung heavy in the room before he finally said, "Well, Christmas isn't all about the presents that we get, is it, Tommy?" Tommy shook his head. "It's about Jesus being born." "That is right. And now that you have Kin and me, we'll make sure you get a present each Christmas." "Tommy, like that." With a huge grin on his face, Tommy stroked his finger over both his gifts, first one and then the other. PC had a soft look about his eyes. "I know you do. Now, should we let Kin open his present? Or do you think I should take his back to the store?" Tommy laughed. "Kin likes presents too." Batting Tommy with the back of his hand, Ken pretended to take Tommy's gifts from him. "That's right, I sure do. In fact, I think I like your presents." Grinning as he hugged his paint and paper close, Tommy turned his back on Ken. "No, Ken, you get your own presents." Lowering his volume, Ken leaned close to Tommy and eyed the parson across the room. "You think PC got me something good?" Tommy giggled uproariously. You have to open it to find out." Ken and PC exchanged a smile, and then the parson handed over the parcel. It was a little smaller than the one Tommy had gotten, flexible yet firm, likely a book of some kind. But there was something resigned about the pinched lip look PC gave him. Ken felt caution rise up inside him. He slowly tugged the bow of the pink and white string off the package, then pressed the paper open. Inside lay a leather-bound book with the words Holy Bible pressed into the front cover. Ken swallowed and ran his hand over the smooth leather. How much had such a beautiful book cost the parson? More than Ken was worth, and that was certain, especially since it wasn't likely a gift he would ever use. But because the parson had given it to him, and he knew the book meant a lot to the man, he would value it and take it with him. "Thank you. It's beautiful." The parson planted his elbows against his knees, clasped his hands, and studied the space between his feet. "I know you think you don't need it, but I pray there will come a day when your eyes will be opened and that you'll find life in those pages." "Yes, sir." And now it was time to get them on a different subject before he had to sit through more of a lecture. "Here." He handed over the other package that still remained by his side. The parson gave him a look that indicated he knew Ken was avoiding the subject, but he seemed willing to let the matter slide. He turned his focus to the gift. Ken pressed his lips together as the parson slowly unwrapped it. Was he going to like it? He had purchased it months ago after saving up all the money he had earned last summer by selling Dixie Griffin fish for her boarding house. "Well, I'll be—" PC reached into the box and pulled out the first of the books, an American commentary on the Book of Matthew. He blinked a couple of times. Ken motioned to the box. "There's a whole set." "I see that. This is very thoughtful of you, Ken. Thank you so much." Ken nodded. "Heard you mention to Marshal Zane that you'd like to have a set. Jerry Hines ordered 'em special, all the way from New York City." Beside Ken, Tommy squirmed. "Only books? Tommy not like books." PC chuckled. "Well, it's a good thing this gift wasn't for you then, isn't it? Want to go paint at the table?" Tommy hopped up from the settee. "Tommy liked to paint." Ken exchanged another smile with PC and set to gathering up the paper wrappings, while PC settled Tommy at the table and helped him understand how to use the new watercolor set. The parson settled one hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Just for a little bit, all right? As soon as Ken and I get the kitchen cleaned up, we've been invited to spend the day with the Callahans." Ken sighed as he tucked the brown paper into the bin by the fireplace. He had forgotten momentarily that he had promised Mrs. Callahan he would come and eat Christmas lunch with them. And then when PC had been prevented from going back east to be with his family, they had invited him also. He supposed if PC was going to be there, it would be less trying than if he went on his own. He always appreciated how the town of Wyldhaven made him feel like he belonged, but that didn't lessen his feeling of awkwardness whenever he was invited to someone's family event. It was a constant reminder that he was an orphan with no family of his own. Well, he glanced to the kitchen where PC had set to washing up the dishes. No one other than PC. But he didn't really count as a pa, since he was only a few years older than Ken. A big brother, then. Ken grinned. A big brother who was glowering at him because he hadn't pitched in to help yet. "Coming," he called. Chapter 3. Ken couldn't help but grin as PC knocked on the Callahans' door. Tommy was so excited that he couldn't stand still. He jiggled up and down, clapping his hands. "We get to have Christmas dinner." Ken nodded. "That's right. Tommy like Christmas dinner." He said the words just as Mrs. Callahan opened the door. She chuckled.
"Well, that's just what we want to hear around here."
She stepped back and swept the door wider.
"Please come in."
Sheriff Reagan was adding wood to the fireplace when they stepped into the parlor. He stood and stretched out one hand toward the parson. "Welcome. Merry Christmas." Marshal Zane and his wife Jacinda, who was the sheriff's mother, sat on the settee. The parson shook the sheriff's hand first. "Thank you for having us." "Of course. Our pleasure." The sheriff reached in his direction. "Kin." Kin clasped his hand. "Sheriff." They exchanged greetings with Marshall and Mrs. Holloway next. The two women rushed off to the kitchen then, and Kin inhaled a big lungful of the scents wafting his way. He was starving, even if he had gone for a second slice of the parson's sausage pie at breakfast. If he didn't watch out, he'd be wiggling worse than Tommy in a moment. He mostly held his silence while the parson and the other men made small talk. It wasn't long before Mrs. Callahan came in to announce the meal was ready. She led them to the dining room and pointed out chairs for everyone. And my, could these women cook. The sheriff had bagged a wild turkey, and somehow Mrs. Callahan had made that bird just as tender as could be. There were mashed potatoes and the most delicious gravy he'd ever had the pleasure of consuming. There were green beans as well as canned cranberries that the sheriff had apparently ordered in special just for his wife. There were bread rolls that melted in your mouth, and plenty of fresh churned butter from the fresh milk Mrs. Callahan purchased from the Castains each week. And then, as if that wasn't enough, she brought out a pumpkin pie and an apple pie and a dried cherry pie. And of course, Kin didn't want to offend her, so he had a slice of each. By the time she brought coffee, Kin didn't think he could swallow another bite if he were paid. He was very thankful when he could follow the men to the parlor and sink onto the floor next to the fireplace. Tommy sank into one of the wingback chairs and put one hand over his stomach. "Tommy hurts." PC chuckled. "I bet you do, as much food as you put away." The parson pegged Kin with a look. "Kin there is the only one who put away more than you did." Kin placed his own hand over his belly. "Kin hurts." Everyone chuckled. The sheriff leaned back in his chair with his coffee cup balanced carefully on one knee. "I understand you're going to be leaving us, Kin?" PC squirmed a little in his seat. "Yes, sir." He studied how the firelight played on the oak floorboards beside him. Mrs. Callahan bustled in then, stood behind the sheriff's chair, and placed her hand on his shoulder.
"Right then, shall we open gifts?"
Kin felt a little bit of panic zip through him. He hadn't thought about getting gifts for the Callahans. Why hadn't he thought of that? The sheriff angled himself to look at his wife over his shoulder. He frowned. "Gifts? I was supposed to get you a gift?" Mrs. Callahan chuckled.
"Reagan Callahan, do go on with you."
Kin couldn't help but admire their easy camaraderie. Even the parson was smiling, though he had lowered his gaze to the space between his feet. Mrs. Callahan smacked her hand against her husband's shoulder.
"Reagan is putting you all on. I think we should give the first gift to Tommy. What does everyone else think?"
The sheriff gave an exaggerated, long-suffering sigh. "What? I want to go first." He grinned then. Tommy smiled. You can go first." Everyone chuckled as the sheriff reassured Tommy he'd only been joking. And as Kin admired the homey scene, he realized how much he was going to miss all these people when he left tomorrow. Reminding himself not to go all sentimental, he glanced at PC and was thankful to see him pull a small envelope from his back pocket. At least they could stay without the embarrassment of not having a gift for the Callahans. And he was thankful for that, because he was looking forward to watching the sheriff open his present on account of how he had helped make it happen. As if she too were remembering, Mrs. Callahan gave him a nervous little smile and clutched her hands beneath her chin. There were more packages beneath the tree than there were people in the room. Mrs. Callahan handed the first one to Tommy. It was small and flat and square. Tommy had not lost any of his enthusiasm for tearing open presents, and in no time he had the paper torn away. The gift was a beginning primer. Tommy exclaimed and fawned over the pictures. Mrs. Callahan, who had once been the town schoolteacher, gave the parson a glance.
"If you would permit me, I would like to start coming by and seeing if I could teach Tommy to read."
The parson gave a nod of approval. Of course, I think that's a grand idea. Sheriff Reagan handed another package to Tommy. This one was a new set of clothes, sewed for him by Mrs. Holloway. Just as PC had taught him over the past few months, Tommy politely expressed his thanks, though he was much more taken with the book. The next 2 packages were handed to the parson. Mrs. Callahan had sewn him a blue silk scarf. She flushed a bit when he thanked her.
I do hope it's all right. Jacinda helped me with it quite a bit.
It's perfect, PC said. It will come in very handy on these cold mornings.
Along with?
Mrs. Holloway pointed for him to open the other package that was from her and the marshal. It was a soft sheepskin coat, leather on the outside and fluffy wool on the inside. The parson thrust his arms into the sleeves. It fits perfectly, thank you. The sheriff fished under the tree for more presents, and Kin had to chuckle at how antsy he felt with anticipation to see the man open those boots. But the next 2 packages were handed to him. He hadn't expected that. He'd thought the remaining packages under the tree would be for the Holloways and Callahans. This one first. The sheriff tapped the smaller gift. But Kin, before you open it, I just want to say a few words. Uh-oh. Kin offered a good-natured grin, but a swirl of queasiness swept through his stomach. He never much liked being the center of attention. Wyldhaven has been your home for a lot of years. Kin nodded. Yes, sir. Ever since Pa moved us here right after Ma passed. He did his best to dispel the nausea at the thought of those years. He tried to push away thoughts of the failure his father had become, but again the question he'd pondered this morning reared its head. Was he destined to become like his pa? Clenching his teeth, he focused on the sheriff. Well, Charlotte and I want you to know that you are welcome to come back to town any time, and so we got you a little something to keep Wyldhaven on your mind while you're away. Kin dropped his focus to the parcel. These were good people. Go on and open it. With the reality of his future hanging over his head, Kin slowly tore the paper from the package. Inside was a small wooden box. He opened that to reveal a beautiful gold compass. The cover was engraved with an image of Wyldhaven's Main Street. It's beautiful. Kin ran his thumb over the engraving. Mrs. Callahan clapped her hands.
Oh, good. I'm glad you like it. Belle Castaigne did the drawing, and Jerry Hines embossed the lid himself.
Kin felt a lump at the back of his throat. This means a lot. Thank you. The sheriff smiled. Our pleasure. That's so you will always be able to find your way back to us. Kin swallowed. He had never considered himself sentimental, but hang it if he didn't have something stinging his eyes. He quickly tore into the next package. It was another sheepskin coat, just like PC's. This will come in handy on my trip. Thank you. He made sure to make eye contact with both the marshal and his wife. Mrs. Holloway dipped her chin. You're welcome. I sewed those myself. The sheep were from the Nolan farm. That makes it all the more special. Kin smoothed his hands down the front of the coat, relishing the soft feel of the suede leather. It was as though every gift given to him today was intended to remind him of this place. The Bible would remind him of PC and his constant, unwavering reiterations of its message. The compass with a picture of Main Street and the coat made by Mrs. Holloway and from Nolan's spread sheep. He wouldn't be able to escape any memories with all of those reminders. Chapter 4. The sheriff angled to look at his wife. All right, Charlotte, your turn. He lifted one of the packages from under the tree and thrust it toward her. The marshal stood and swept a hand to the spot on the settee he'd occupied near his wife. Here, sit. Mrs. Callahan flushed prettily and sank down next to her mother-in-law, but her gaze was fixed on her husband across the room in the armchair near the fire.
What did you get me?
The sheriff shook his head. Open it and find out.
Very well.
Mrs. Callahan took her sweet time untying the string from around the package, and then she gasped. Oh, Reagan. She lifted a section of cream lace from the packaging. It's absolutely gorgeous. The sheriff was grinning from ear to ear. Thought you might like that. Now you. Mrs. Callahan flapped her hand toward the biggest box under the tree.
Ken couldn't withhold a smile. He was thankful that he had been able to help Mrs. Callahan in some small way to be able to give her husband the gift she had wanted to, even if she didn't know it was him. The sheriff lifted the box and gave it a gentle shake. But Bill Giddens must have packed those boots carefully because no sound emanated from the box. The sheriff turned the box this way and that. It's somewhat heavy, but not overly so. Mrs. Callahan's eyes sparkled, but she wasn't giving away anything. Mrs. Holloway chuckled. "Oh, Reagan, do just open it." To the room in general, she said, "He's been this way since he was a boy. Always has to investigate before opening it." All right, I'm getting there. But you can't rush the joy of Christmas." With his eyes closed, the sheriff lifted the lid from the box. He gave the package a sniff. "Smells like leather." He opened his eyes then, and they continued to grow wider as they took in the boots in the box. Everyone in the room chuckled. His pleasure was obvious. "Charlie!" he exclaimed. "However did you afford such a fine pair?" He removed one of the boots from the box and angled it to examine the embossing in the firelight. Mrs. Callahan gave a shrug of one shoulder. "Well, if the truth be told, I had some help with that. I knew I didn't have the money, and I was so disappointed, but Ken gave me an idea. And it was a good one, too. I've been baking pies and selling them in Dixie's boarding house for weeks now." The sheriff looked up and pegged Ken with a look. "Wait a minute." Ken found himself thinking one of Tommy's favorite phrases. Uh-oh. He had a feeling a cat was about to crawl out of a bag. Mrs. Callahan blinked. "What is it?" The parson sat straighter, giving Ken a curious look. "There's still one more package beneath the tree." Ken tried to divert everyone's attention, but no one took his bait. Ken winced a little and wrinkled his nose at the sheriff. He could tell the man was putting two and two together. And sure enough, the sheriff threw back his head and slapped his thigh in laughter. "Ken Davis, you are a sly old dog." Mrs. Callahan still looked confused. "Reagan, please do fill the rest of us in." The sheriff gave his wife a sheepish look. "I'm betting that you've been selling apple pies in Dixie's diner?" Charlotte nodded. Ken studied the floor near his feet as the sheriff laughed again. "Ken caught me checking the street to make sure you weren't in sight. I was just about to carry our bushels of apples across the street to sell to Jerry Hines so that I could buy you that lace. But Ken convinced me to sell those apples to him. He was returning them to our cellar when you saw him coming out. He later told me that it was on account of he wanted a slice of your apple pie today, but now we know the truth. He knew you needed those apples so you could buy me those boots." "Oh, Ken!" Mrs. Callahan crossed the room and bent to give him a hug. "You are such a dear!" Ken puffed out a breath of relief. At least the sheriff had only put half the story together. As she retreated toward the couch, Ken looked down and scuffed at a mark on the floor with his boot. "It wasn't anything, and the fact that I got to be here to see you both exchange those gifts was repayment enough for my troubles. Just sit back in your seat and don't think on it any more." But in the next moment, his hopes were dashed. "Wait a minute," Mrs. Callahan exclaimed, spinning to face him and plunking her hands on her hips. "After the Carver siblings stole my money, I wasn't going to have enough to order the boots. But when I arrived at Mr. Giddens' place to tell him I couldn't get them after all, he said someone had already paid for them. You avoided my questions that day when I came to the parsonage to ask if it was you, but if you paid Reagan for those apples, you surely wouldn't have wanted the present of the boots to be ruined when the money was stolen. I'm asking you straight out, Ken Davis, in front of witnesses. It was you, wasn't it?" He raised a gesture that he hoped conveyed that he didn't know the answer, but would prevent him from having to tell an outright lie. "I'm sure Bill Giddens would be happy to tell you who did it now that Christmas is past." He pointed quickly at the one remaining package under the tree. "Don't forget there's still one more present." "Oh, no, you don't, Ken Davis. You aren't going to weasel your way out of this. I got the stolen money back when the Carvers turned themselves in. Kane made sure his siblings repaid me every cent. So, do I owe you money or not?" Ken shook his head. "You most certainly don't owe me any money, Mrs. Callahan." But knowing he was caught, He couldn't help a grin. Mrs. Callahan plunked her hands on her hips. "You said it wasn't you." He shook his head. No, ma'am. I do believe if you think back, you'll realize that I never once said it wasn't me." She shook a finger at him. "Don't you leave today before I give you that money. That was very sweet of you. Thank you so much." Ken gripped the back of his neck, embarrassed to have everyone in the room staring at him. But it was the quick nod of approval that PC gave him that kicked him right in the heart. He scrambled to the tree. Look here. This one says it's for you, Mrs. Holloway." He thrust the package toward her, and thankfully everyone turned their attention to watching her open the gift. She angled a coy glance at her husband. They'd only been married less than a year. "What did you get me, dear?" Ken grinned. Why was that the first question most people asked when handed a gift? The marshal didn't miss a beat. "Garden seeds. I know you'll want to go to work planting them just as soon as the weather warms enough." It was patently obvious that he was joking. Mrs. Holloway wrinkled her nose at him. Inside her package were yards and yards of various materials. Mrs. Holloway oohed and awed over each one. Here she exclaimed about how this material was perfect for new curtains, and there she exclaimed over the softness of a long piece of silk. Finally, she stood and moseyed to her husband's side. She curved her hands around his arm and looked up at him. "You know just how to please me, dear. Thank you so much." The marshal gave her a quick kiss and a smile. "You're welcome." "Now, you might be wondering why I don't have a package under the tree for you." She swished her skirts a little, and Ken marveled over married people flirting with one another. "I hadn't noticed." The marshal winked at her. "Well, I didn't forget you, but I'm awaiting the delivery of your gift. It should be arriving at any moment." The marshal winged one brow upward. "Delivery?" She nodded. "Indeed, and I'm just as much in debt to Ken for helping me get your gift as Charlotte seems to be." Again, all eyes in the room focused on him. Ken waved a hand. "It wasn't anything." "Oh, it was too. Ken, you are too modest." She returned her attention to her husband. "There was that avalanche, you see, and your gift was on the train. Ken helped me ride out to get it. You remember that day he and I were running errands?" The marshal grinned. "I knew there was something fishy about that whole scenario." Mrs. Holloway batted her lashes at him. "There was indeed, but when you see what I got you, you'll forgive me, I promise." As if her words had summoned it, a knock came to the door at that precise moment. "Oh, that must be Joe now." Mrs. Holloway hurried to open the door. "Come on, everyone, you'll all want to see this." The marshal frowned as they all followed his wife out onto the porch. "Joe has my give—" He froze and stared. Joe stood in the yard with that beautiful Appaloosa colt prancing on the lead rope. As if by mutual instruction, everyone moved to the Callahans' porch rail and leaned against it, leaving the marshal and Mrs. Holloway standing at the top of the steps. Deputy Joe grinned up at them. "Merry Christmas, everyone." They all returned the greeting, and then Mrs. Holloway stretched her hand toward the colt. "The dam and sire are the ones we saw on our wedding tour." "I don't know what to say." The marshal descended the steps and rubbed his hands down the horse's neck as he accepted the lead rope from Joe. Mrs. Holloway clasped her hands before her. "The thing is, he's still green broke. Kane Carver's been working with him for several weeks now, but he still has a way to go. The one I ordered came down sick right before they were to put it on the train, and they sent this one instead." The horse bobbed its head and blew, then wuffed at the marshal's hat, nibbling at the rim. He laughed and ducked away. "He's beautiful, Jack. I couldn't be more pleased." The marshal pulled his wife toward him, and Ken had a feeling this time he wouldn't just be offering her a peck of a kiss. Mrs. Callahan stepped back by the door. "Let's all go back in where it's warm, shall we?" On that note, it was time for him to mosey on out of here. He offered his thanks once more to the Callahans, retrieved his gifts, and then paused in the doorway of the parlor. "If you all will forgive me, I need to go and speak to the Carvers before I leave town in the morning." Deputy Joe, who had come in from outside and was seated on the hearth, raised him a look. "Ken, swing by our place a little later, would you?" Ken nodded. "I can do that right after I speak to Kane at the Castaigne place. A couple hours from now be all right?" The deputy nodded. That'll be perfect. See you then." With that, Ken retreated. In the yard, he skirted around the marshal and his wife, who were still sweet-talking with one another, and fetched his mount from the barn. He pulled in a full breath of the crisp mountain air and swept a glance up and down the road as he kicked his horse into a trot toward the Castains. He sure was going to miss this place. Chapter 5. Ken rode his mount into the Castains' yard and dismounted before the hitching rail. Cain Carver must have heard him coming, for he was stepping out of the barn just as Ken started toward it. Cain stretched out one hand.
"Davis, good to see you. The Castains are all in the house there."
Ken shook his hand.
"Actually, you're the man I've come to see."
Cain frowned.
"I am?"
Ken suddenly felt a bit awkward about what he had intended to propose.
"You are."
He didn't want the man to think he was offering him charity, so he'd best proceed with caution.
"You see, tomorrow I'm leaving to go to Seattle. Not sure when I'll be back."
Cain nodded.
"Heard as much."
He grinned.
"You might be breaking my sister's heart by riding out so soon after we've arrived."
Ken felt warmth in his face. He studied the side of the barn.
"Well, I'm just not in a place where—"
"Relax." Cain pounded a palm against his shoulder.
"Just pulling your leg a little."
Relieved, Ken pressed ahead.
"Well, the reason I stopped by is that I have this place. Used to be my pa's, and I inherited it when he passed on."
Ken kicked at a mound of snow.
"It's not much, but it's bigger than the room you three are sharing in the barn there."
He tipped a nod toward the building.
"My cabin has 2 bedrooms and a good cook stove, and it's nice and warm. Wondered if you would be interested in renting it while I'm in the city."
Cain folded his arms. If Ken was any judge, that was a bit of a hopeful look on Cain's face, and yet there was caution, too.
"How much?"
This was where Ken knew he had to continue cautiously. He didn't want to offend the man's pride.
"Well, here's the thing. I'm riding the train to the city, and I can't take my horse with me. I plan to ask the Castains if I can board him here in their barn since I know they have room. $1.50 a month is the going rate, and that's about what I was thinking to charge for rent on my place. I know it's a little more than you're paying here now, but if you agree, you could just pay the rent to the Castains on my behalf to cover the boarding of my horse. That is, providing they agree to board him for me."
"Of course we agree." Ken spun to see Zoe Castain standing on the porch. She nodded. "Yes, we'd be happy to." Ken felt a wave of relief sweep through him. He had wanted to finagle a way to get the Castains a little bit more money each month and also help the Carvers. If Cain Carver agreed, it looked like everything would work out. He looked back at the man. Cain leaned into his heels and seemed to ponder the offer. Finally, he said,
"I'll agree on one condition."
Ken felt his hopes deflate.
"What's that?" "That you let me pay $2 a month rent. We both know that's more in line with what's regular around these parts."
Ken grinned and stretched out his hand.
"All right. You keep the extra 50 cents and we'll settle up when I come back."
If he ever came back.
"Zoe can give you directions to the place when you're ready. String on the door latch is out. Just go on in and make yourselves at home."
"Will do." It gave Ken pleasure to see the excitement in the man's eyes. Must be a relief to have a real place to house his family. Zoe stepped to Ken's side and looked up at him. "Are you coming back?" She searched his face. He swallowed. Zoe had always seemed to be able to read his mind. She folded her arms against the cold, still scrutinizing. He whipped off his new sheepskin coat and settled it around her shoulders. He gave her a wink.
"I'll come back for certain if you tell me you'll be waiting for me."
Zoe flushed and clutched the lapels of his coat as she studied his face. "Ken Davis, do go on with you." Cain Carver chuckled and tipped his head toward the barn.
"I think I'll go back inside where it's warm and leave you two alone for a bit. My brother and sister will be happy to hear the good news. All the best to you."
Cain disappeared into the barn, sliding the door shut behind him. But Ken barely heard him go. He folded his arms against the chill breeze and studied Zoe. Was the fact that she was blushing a good sign? Truth was, He knew that she and Wash maybe had feelings for one another, and while he would court Zoe in a heartbeat, he didn't want to tread on Wash's territory. Zoe dragged her focus to the side of the barn. "Do I have a chance?" She tucked her lower lip between her teeth. "Ken, you know I've always valued your friendship." And there it was. Wash had beat him to it. He gave her a gentle sock on the arm. "Don't go getting all in a dither. I was just joshing with you a little." Her eyes turned soft as they searched his face. "You do know that I love you like a brother, right?" He swallowed, nodded. However, a rock settled into his stomach. No matter that she'd meant to soften her rejection, somehow she'd actually heightened it. He forced himself to say, "I'll always love you like a sister, too." Her shoulders slumped in relief. "You are going to be on time for your party, right?" She took off his jacket and held it out to him. He swung it on and gave her a nod. "Wouldn't miss it for all the world." He would dread it from now until it was over, but because Zoe had put it together for him, he wouldn't miss it. She gave him a little wave and trotted up the stairs of the porch and disappeared into the house. And he couldn't help but feel like maybe his last remaining draw for being in Wyldhaven had just been severed. Since Deputy Joe had asked him to stop by and the Rodante place was close, Ken decided to ride that way on his return to town. When he rode into the yard, a woman he didn't recognize was hanging sheets from the clothesline. She was older, with a bit of gray in the faded brown hair at her temples. He swung down and tipped her a nod. She must be a new resident that Mrs. Rodante was trying to help. She scanned him up and down and then pointed toward the house. "Deputy and his wife are in the kitchen there. Reckon you must be the fella the deputy said would be stopping by. He said to tell you to come on in." "Obliged." Ken touched the brim of his hat and then took the steps up to the porch. He felt a bit awkward walking in without knocking, but he figured maybe the deputy had a reason for telling him just to enter. He pushed the door open and poked his head inside. No one was in sight, but the woman had said that Deputy Joe and Leora were in the kitchen. Closing the door behind him, he strode in the direction of the kitchen. He was striding past the dining table when from inside the kitchen Mrs. Rodante gave a little titter. "Now, Joe, do be serious. I've been trying to get you alone all morning so I can tell you something, and I can't speak when you won't stop kissing me." Ken froze. He wasn't about to walk into the kitchen now. He plunked his hands on his hips. Should he retreat and knock on the front door after all? "But it's Christmas," the deputy murmured. His voice was low and intimate. "Shouldn't a man be allowed to kiss his wife as often as he wants on Christmas?" "I suppose he should, but there's really something I need to tell you, so step back." Though she tried to sound stern, she laughed again. "You're no fun," the deputy groused. Ken couldn't suppress a grin. Definitely not the right moment to announce himself. Retreat it was, otherwise he'd be eavesdropping. He turned and took a step toward the front door. "I'm with child, Joe. Merry Christmas." Mrs. Rodante's words froze Ken in place. A huge grin bloomed. There were several beats of silence, and then Deputy Joe finally said, "Well, I'll be." There was another moment of pause before Joe continued in a husky voice, "Come here." This truly wasn't a conversation he should be overhearing. On tiptoe, Ken beat a hasty retreat to the front door. Once he was on the front porch, he grinned and scrubbed one hand over his face. He couldn't be happier for the Rodantes. He waited a few minutes and then knocked loudly. Deputy Joe opened it, grinning from ear to ear. "Ken, welcome, come in." Ken swiped off his Stetson and stepped over the threshold. "You look happy." Deputy Joe folded his arms and appeared lost in thought for a moment, but then his grin broadened. "I am. I truly am. I've just learned that I'm to be a father." "You don't say." Ken did his best to look surprised. "Congratulations." "Thank you. Thank you so much. What can I do for you? The deputy asked. Ken twisted his hat through his hands. You asked me to stop by? Deputy Joe snapped his fingers. Right. He called toward the kitchen. Leora, Ken is here. Mrs. Redante bustled in, drying her hands on a towel. Merry Christmas, Ken. She smiled. We're so glad you were able to stop by. I know we'll see you at your farewell gathering this afternoon, but Joe and I wanted to give you a little something to express our thanks for helping us as you did when Ruby was killed. She cleared her throat and blinked rapidly a couple times. That's really not necessary. I didn't do all that much. You are too modest by far. We never would have recovered our stolen property or found out what happened to Ruby if you hadn't acted as you did. Well, ma'am, Ken's feet shuffled. I was only doing what anyone in that situation would have done. Deputy Joe clapped him on the shoulder. Nevertheless, we heard you were headed to Seattle and thought that maybe this would come in handy. He thrust a long, lidded oak box in Ken's direction. The top of the box was inset with a round medallion, and brass screws held the edges of the box together. The front of the box had a brass keyhole. Ken's heart pounded. He looked at Deputy Joe. Is this what I think it is? The deputy grinned. Open it. Oh! He dug into his pocket. Here's the key. Ken opened the lid, and sure enough, inside, snugged into a bed of red velvet, lay a brand-new Colt revolver. The placard in the lid read, Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company. Ken was speechless. He had his pa's old pistol, but this is one of Colt's latest designs. Deputy Joe grinned broadly. Hear tell they're coming out with a new one, but for now, yes, this is one of the most recent models. And he reached to the mantel above the hearth and took down 2 boxes of cartridges. I got you these, too. You never know what you might come up against in the big city. Always good to be prepared, I say. And I know you'll handle it safely. Thank you. You're welcome. Merry Christmas. The Redantes spoke the words in unison, and then they all laughed. Ken hated to rush off so soon after receiving a gift, but he really needed to get back to town if he was going to be on time for his send-off. If you'll forgive me, I better get going. I don't want to experience Zoe's ire if I'm late for her gathering. We understand. Deputy Joe waved off his apology. We're just about to head that way ourselves. Yes, we are. I was just in the kitchen putting the finishing touches on a batch of sweet rolls that I'm bringing. Ken's mouth watered. All the more reason for me not to be late, ma'am. You make the best sweet rolls around. She smiled. Well, thank you. I'll save you the biggest one. Ken wished she would offer him one for the ride back to town, to sort of get his appetite whet, but of course he couldn't mention it. Deputy Joe stretched out his hand. We're sure gonna miss you round these parts. Don't be a stranger, hear? No, sir. Yes, sir. I won't. As he strode to his horse and tucked the new revolver into his saddlebags, Ken couldn't help but chuckle. Seemed like several of the townsfolk had wanted to give him parting gifts without making a show of it at this afternoon's gathering. And when he thought about it, he supposed that was one thing that made Wyldhaven special. Everyone was kind without wanting to get credit for it. Chapter 6. A weariness washed over Ken as he trotted his horse back toward town. If this day had revealed anything to him, it was how much he appreciated the town of Wyldhaven and all the people who meant so much to him. Was he really going to follow through and get on that train tomorrow? He gritted his teeth. He had to, because how would it look for the whole town to come to a going-away shindig and then have him decide to stay? Besides, though he admired and appreciated most of the people in town, it wasn't like he had anyone to stick around for. There were PC and Tommy, but he would come back to visit them. Someday. Maybe after he had a family. The thought crashed through him and he couldn't suppress a bark of laughter. After he had a family? Where had that thought come from? He reined his horse around a pothole in the road. True, there weren't really any women in Wyldhaven for him. Sure, he admired Zoe a lot, but he wouldn't barge in there knowing how Wash felt about her, even if Wash had never admitted as such. Besides, Wash was a much better man than him, and Kin couldn't see Zoe ever putting up with his shenanigans. Belle was gorgeous, and at one time he'd thought about pursuing her, but she'd grown quiet and distant over the past couple years, hard around the edges. Besides, he'd heard she was planning on leaving Wyldhaven herself. There was also Aurora, but she'd never given him any indication that she was even the slightest bit interested in him. She treated him more like a brother. He smirked. The new gal, Maud? She was cute. Well, no, more than cute. Pretty, but a bit too quiet for his liking. No, when it came right down to it, there was nothing holding him here. And if he stayed, what kind of adventures might he miss out on? All this angst was simply a few jitters over the unknown future. But he could do this. He wanted to do this. His horse trotted into town on the road just behind Dixie's boarding house, and standing behind the building, Dixie, Doc, and Butch Nolan were admiring the sleigh he'd built for Mrs. Griffin as her gift to her husband. He grinned and reined to a stop. "Ken!" Mrs. Griffin flapped a hand for him to get down and join them. Then she wrapped both her hands around her husband's arm and rested her head on his shoulder. Doc glanced his way. He had baby Ellery, who appeared more like a cocoon of blankets, resting in the crook of one elbow. "You made this?" Ken lifted one shoulder. "Yes, sir." It hadn't been that hard to figure out. He'd studied a few of the sleighs in the Seattle shop when Mrs. Griffin had asked him to take that trip for her after little Ellery's early arrival. Doc strode in a circle around the sleigh. "It's amazing, Ken." "Thank you. I'm glad you like it. Here, let me show you a few things." He strode to the rear of the sleigh and showed Doc the hidden compartment he'd built into the back to house Doc's medicines. "The cabinet locks so you can keep stuff from being stolen. And here." He strode to the floorboards where the rider's feet would go and lifted the hinged tops of the compartments he'd built into the flooring. "You can put hot bricks in here to keep your feet warm as you travel. Or," he shrugged, "it could be another place for storing supplies if you prefer." He lifted a finger and pointed out the areas where axles could be strapped in. "I also made it so that, in the summertime, you can pull off the runners and add wheels instead. The axles and wheels will have to be stored separately, as I couldn't figure out a good place to store them on the sleigh itself, but I don't think that'll be too much of an inconvenience." "Certainly not. You seem to have thought of everything." Pleased to see how excited Doc was, Ken scuffed at the snow with his boot. He could go on explaining how he'd put the windbreak up front or tell about the extra padding he'd given to the seats, but Doc would discover those things soon enough on his own. Butch Nolan gave a loud whistle. "Sure is the prettiest sleigh I ever did lay eyes on, Ken." Ken smiled. "Thank you." Baby Ellery gave a little bleat from Doc's arms and poked one arm out of the blanket, waving it in the air. Dixie straightened, and that's our cue to head back inside. She pressed one fist into the small of her back and gave a little stretch. But I need to find someone to help me keep the boarding house rooms clean. I scrubbed all the floors yesterday, and my body simply isn't as young as it used to be." Doc wrapped one arm protectively about his wife's shoulders. "I wish I had more time to help you." She waved a hand. "You'll practically run off your feet yourself. I'll post an ad on the bulletin board at the post office come Monday. I'll even throw in a free room and food to sweeten the deal." She held out her hand to Mr. Nolan. "Thanks again, Butch, for keeping it for me till today." Mr. Nolan pumped her hand like a man on a fire wagon about to lose his home. "My pleasure, Mrs. Griffin. My pleasure." Ken gathered up his reins, ready to get his mount to the livery and then head to the party, but Mrs. Griffin stopped him with a hand to his arm as Butch Nolan rode away. "I'm actually glad you stopped by. Do you have a few minutes to come up to the house? Flynn and I got you a little something to show our appreciation for, well, not just for the sleigh. She paused and blinked a couple of times. Ken frowned. Was she fighting back tears over his departure? He swallowed. He'd always admired Mrs. Griffin, maybe more than any other person in town, because she always believed in him. Whenever he failed and found himself in trouble with PC, if he ended up on her doorstep to sell her a catch, she would give him that knowing smile of hers and give his arm a squeeze. It conveyed that she still cared for him, and that he could do better the next time without a word being exchanged. But to think that she cared for him enough to cry at his departure? He'd never thought that would be the case. Mrs. Griffin offered a watery smile. Well, she dabbed at her eyes. We just got you a little something to let you know we're going to miss you. Do you have time? Ken nodded. A little. Yes, ma'am. He grinned to ease the moment. Don't suppose they'll start the shindig without me. She laughed. True, I suppose not. Follow us, then. Doc led the way up the boarding house stairs to the apartments they shared with Rose Pottinger. Ken swiped off his Stetson as they stepped inside. Mrs. Pottinger was knitting by the far window. She offered Ken a smile. Oh, good, you came up. I do hope you'll forgive me for missing your send-off later. These old bones don't take to the snow and ice anymore. He curled the brim of his hat into one hand. It's fine, ma'am. Please, stay inside where it's warm. Mrs. Griffin hurried to Doc's side. Here, I'll take her. Can you get the gift? Doc nodded and disappeared into one of the bedrooms. Mrs. Griffin bounced the baby, who seemed determined to let her mind be known now. Ken felt awkward standing with the two women without conversation, but with the baby squalling as she was, there wasn't much point in trying to strike one up. After just a moment, Ellery calmed to a low fuss. He swept his hat toward the baby and called, Good lungs. Mrs. Griffin smiled as she continued to bounce. She cooed her next words as though she was speaking them to the baby. Yes, I'm afraid she's only just begun to state her opinion on certain things. Doc emerged from the bedroom with a brown leather valise in his hands. It sported a red bow tied to the handle. He smiled as he presented it with a little flourish. From us to you. We hope it'll make your travels easier and that you'll be able to use it to come home to visit once in a while. Thank you. Ken turned the bag this way and that, admiring the buffed shine of the leather. It's beautiful. I only had my old knapsack, so this'll be right useful. Mrs. Griffin gave her signature squeeze to his arm, still jostling Ellery a little. Merry Christmas, Ken. Do come back to see us. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I'm going to have to deal with this little Mrs. Needs. I'll be over to the church in a few minutes. Thank you, ma'am. He lifted the valise. This means a lot. My pleasure. I'll miss our little chats in the boarding house kitchen, and my patrons will miss your fresh-caught fish. He smiled. I'm sure there'll be another young man you can talk into fishing for you. The pay is good. Aiden Castaigne or Grant Nolan, perhaps. You can make it a competition and get twice the fish. She chuckled. I'll have to ask their parents, but that's a grand idea. Ellery resumed her squalling then, and Mrs. Griffin disappeared with her into the bedroom. Doc stretched out his hand and grasped Ken's in a firm grip. Davis, God bless you as you go. Remember the truths you've learned here in Wyldhaven, and don't ever lose your giving spirit, son. Thank you, sir. I'll do my best. Doc saw him to the door then, and Ken realized he'd better hurry up to the parsonage before the gathering commenced so he could leave all these presents in his room. He took his mount to the livery, hastily unsaddled him, and then skirted around the back of the church and tromped up the hill to the parsonage by the back way so no one who might already be at the church would see him and call out. Each family had given him these gifts in private, and he didn't want to embarrass anyone by having to explain where everything had come from. People might start comparing, or worse, feel badly if they hadn't gotten him something. Some of the gifts were worth more than others, but each one held a special place in his heart, and that was what mattered. Chapter 7. Ken stood in his room, drawing deep breaths, and willing himself to find the courage to walk down that hill and say goodbye to everyone. All his chats with various families today had been hard enough, and those hadn't really been the final goodbye. He'd known that he would see each of them again at Zoe's get-together. However, now, this seemed so final. It was final. Yet he was leaving to pursue his dreams, so shouldn't that mean something to him? Shouldn't he be filled with excitement instead of dread? Hang it, he wanted a drink. And that right there was the main reason for his dread. He was turning into his pa. He didn't want that, And yet each time he decided he was done with drink, he would have a moment where he caved into the craving, and he'd wake up the following morning suffering the after effects and the regret.
"How did I seed such a weakling? When are you going to become a man, son?"
He could hear the words as if Pa was standing right here in the room with him. He inhaled, held it, shook out his hands. A knock sounded on the front door. He released the breath in a whoosh, took up his hat, and strode out to see who it was. Likely someone here to fetch him for the gathering because he was running late. When he swung open the door, Wash stood on the porch, thumbs hooked in his belt loops, sporting that familiar, friendly smile. And blast if Kin didn't feel a bit of a sting in his eyes. Wash had been a friend since they were still in the schoolhouse that used to meet in Mrs. Griffin's boarding house dining room, back when Mrs. Callahan was still single and teaching. Actually, Wash had been more like a brother. He had understood Kin's difficult childhood and silently supported him through it. On mornings when they would go fishing before school, Wash would bring him paper-wrapped sandwiches because, though he'd never said it, he'd known about how Pa used to spend all their money on drink, leaving Kin's belly aching and empty.
"Afternoon," Wash said. "I'm here to fetch you for the shindig. Zoe's beside herself thinking you decided not to come."
He grinned.
"That might be a slight exaggeration, but you know how she gets."
Kin chuckled and reached for his coat on the peg just inside the door.
"Sure do, but I wouldn't do that to her."
Wash looked down and scuffed one boot against the boards of the porch.
"Before we go down,"
he dug something from his coat pocket and held it out to Kin.
"I made this for you."
Kin hesitated, simply looking at Wash's outstretched hand. He couldn't quite tell what Wash held, but somehow taking it seemed like the final link in the chain that would take him from this place. He stepped past the threshold and pulled the door shut. Still, he didn't reach for the gift. He'd gotten Wash a gift, too. He'd planned to tell him about it at the end of the gathering, but maybe it would be better this way. Wash cleared his throat and blinked. He gave his hand a little shake.
"Go on, it's not going to bite."
Kin smirked and accepted the gift. It was a furl of leather. When Kin unrolled it, he saw that it was a hand-sewn holster with a belt. The belt had several loops to hold bullets, and the buckle was plain but sturdy. Wash shifted.
"Deputy Joe told me about the Colt he got you. I sized it real careful like so's it'd fit just right."
"It's great." Kin couldn't disguise the gravel in his voice. He cleared his throat. "I got you something, too. You stop by and see old Bill Giddens tomorrow after I leave, and he'll give it to you." He hoped Wash would like the pair of black boots. He'd had old Bill make them just like the cavalry units wore so that when Wash joined up, he'd have a set that fit well and were comfortable instead of the assigned ones that were often ill-fitting.
"You didn't have to do that."
Kin lifted the holster. "You didn't have to do this." Wash's lips tipped up.
"Guess that's what friends are for."
He held up one hand. Kin hooked his thumb with Wash's, grasped his hand, and then gave him a friendly shoulder bump. And that was about enough of that, or he was going to start blubbering like a baby. He motioned to his gift. "I'll just put this inside and be right down." Wash gave him a knowing look.
"I'll wait. And Kin?"
"Yeah?"
"Take care of yourself, would you?"
His throat felt thick, like it might close off at any moment. He nodded. "Same to you." With that, he disappeared back into the parsonage. He stood for a moment, pulling in a couple calming breaths, and then hurried to deposit the holster in the satchel that the Griffins had given him. But just as he was about to do so, he paused. Why not strap it on right now? It would be good for him to get used to the weight of the gun at his side. Yes. He buckled on the holster, loaded the Colt, and dropped it in. Resting his hand on the gun's handle, he relished the feel of it in his palm. It was good that he'd have protection in Seattle. After all, it was a lot bigger of a place than Wyldhaven, and one never knew what kind of unsavory characters he might run into. Yes, this was a good feeling. He hurried out then to join Wash, and they strode down the hill toward the church. The inside of the church was warm and full of people milling about. Someone had cleared all the pews to the sides of the room, leaving the main part of the room open for fellowship. A collective cheer rose up as Wash nudged Kin into the room. Kin felt his face heat. Every eye in the room was on him, and he hated that. Everyone in town knew what a failure he was. What had made them turn out to see off a sorry specimen of a man like him? From the front of the room, Zoe bounced up and down and clapped her hands. "Kin, could you join me up front, please?" Kin pressed his lips together. He'd have to remind himself to get her back for this later. As he made his way through the crowd, people clapped him on the back or his shoulders and murmured kind words. "Sorry to see you go, kid." Jerry Hines gave him a nod. "Don't forget about us on your big adventure," Ewan McGinty added. "You've got one last night tonight to partake of my finest bottle." Kin nodded and pressed forward. Ewan obviously only wanted him in town so as he'd keep spending his money in the alehouse. When he reached Zoe's side, she looped one hand through his arm and smiled up at him. Looking down at her, he sighed. Too bad she'd made it so clear that she only saw him as a brother earlier. "Everyone, if I could have your attention?" Zoe stood on her tiptoes. Kin grinned. Did she think that made her soft voice sound louder? The room did quiet, however, leaving Kin squirming inside again to have every eye on him. "First, Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas," everyone echoed. "Here's what we're going to do this afternoon. First, we have food." A collective cheer rose through the room. Zoe laughed. "Yes, thank you to all the ladies who worked so hard to cook for us." Everyone clapped. When the sound died down, Zoe continued, "After we eat, we'll have a time of fellowship. Kin will sit at the head table there, and if you'd like to say your farewells, you can do so at that time." Kin withheld a grunt. If she'd wanted to torture him for leaving, she was doing a mighty fine job of it. "Then, to conclude, I've asked Parson Clay to say a few words and pray over Kin as he leaves us." Her voice choked up on those last words, and a deeper hush fell over the room. Kin studied the floor at his feet. Zoe gave his arm a little squeeze. She looked up at him, moisture shimmering in her eyes. "And while he's gone, we'll pray every day that God brings him safely back to us." She flapped a hand before her face, giving a little chuckle. "Now, let's eat before I dissolve into a blubbering puddle right here in front of you all." A ripple of laughter filled the room, and Zoe nudged him toward the tables along the east wall. "You first, Kin. You're the guest of honor." He wasn't hungry. Didn't think he could eat a bite, but he'd fill his plate to the brim if it made this sweet woman happy. Turned out, he didn't need to worry about trying to eat, because everyone ignored Zoe's fellowship time comment. From the moment he set his plate on the table and sank into the seat Zoe had directed him to, townsfolk started coming over to say their farewells. He would stand and chat with them for a few moments, and then he would just get seated and pick up his fork when the next family would stop by, and he'd have to stand again. After a full hour, his plate was still full, and he felt like a bobber on a fishing line being teased by a fat trout. Up, down, up, down. But finally, the line died off, and folks settled into eating their own food, leaving him to reflect. Across the room, PC chatted with the new banker and his wife. Where would he be if the parson hadn't taken him in when he did? He would ever be grateful for the man's kindness, even if he hadn't shown it so well over the years. As if sensing that he was being studied, PC lifted his gaze and met Kin's across the room. He said a parting word to the Olens, and then strode toward Kin. "We should probably wind things down so people can get home before it gets too dark and the temperatures drop. You ready?" His gaze dipped to Kin's still-filled plate. Kin pushed it back. "Yeah. Wasn't much hungry, I guess." A glint of humor filled PC's eyes. "Hard to eat when people won't let you take a bite. I'll give you a few minutes. Mrs. Castaigne's fried chicken is delicious. Give it a try." He nudged the plate back in front of Kin. Kin accepted the gesture for the loving one it was. He nodded. "Yes, sir." With that, PC strode to the front of the room. If I could have everyone's attention, I'll get started with my 4-hour-long sermon so's you can all get home before morning." Ken grinned and took a bite of the chicken. PC was right. This must be a new recipe because he'd had Mrs. Castaigne's chicken plenty of times, and it had never been quite this good. PC flipped open his Bible while he let the laughter die down, and then he lifted his gaze to the room. "You all sound like you think I'm joking." Another ripple of laughter, this time a little uneasy. When PC grinned, Ken could almost hear the collective breath of relief. PC glanced back down at his Bible. "In all seriousness, what I have to say is very short. I know you all need to get back to your evening chores. As many of you know, Ken has lived with me for several years, ever since his pa passed." PC raised a direct gaze in Ken's direction. "I've grown very fond of you, Ken." He cleared his throat. "I love you like a brother. And so it was with a lot of prayer and searching that I pondered what the Lord would have me to say tonight. I wish it wasn't goodbye, but it is. Hopefully not for too long. The passage I chose for this evening is really a blessing. It's what Aaron and his sons, the priests of Israel, were instructed to say to the children of Israel. The passage is in Numbers, chapter 6, verses 22 to 27. And Ken, as you go out, I pray the Lord passes this blessing on to you. The passage reads this way. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, This is the way you shall bless the children of Israel. Say to them, The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So they shall put my name on the children of Israel, and I will bless them. So, kin, as you go, I would like to say this prayer of blessing over you. If you don't mind, join me here at the front." Kin felt the familiar dread of being the center of attention. On top of that, he highly doubted that God had any sort of blessing for him, but out of respect, he would play along. He wiped his fingers on his napkin and then set it back on the table and met PC at the front of the room. PC wrapped an arm around Kin's shoulders and gave him a squeeze. "Please bow your heads with me." Kin dutifully dipped his gaze to the floor. PC's voice rang out loud and clear as he prayed with confidence. "Lord, I know you see Kin, and that you love him so much more than he can even fathom. So, as he goes from this place, I ask that you would bless him and keep him. Make your face shine upon him. Be gracious to him. Lift up your countenance upon him, and give him the peace that can only come from you. Amen." A murmured amen filled the room. "Thanks for coming, everyone. Feel free to be on your way." PC gave him another squeeze and smiled over at him. He lowered his voice so that, in the din that suddenly filled the church, Kin had to strain to hear his words. "I may not have said it much, but I love you. You have one of the kindest hearts I've ever had the pleasure of witnessing. You are giving, generous, and strong, much stronger than you give yourself credit for. And I'm not talking about those muscles you've built up chopping wood for me all these years." Kin couldn't withhold a chuckle, even as PC's words washed over him like a balm. He tucked his lower lip between his teeth, embarrassed by such praise. "You can try to outrun God, Kin. But I'll just tell you from experience, God is faster. You'll never be able to leave him behind. He'll be there, loping along backwards in front of you, and dodging every attempt you desperately make to try to push him out of your way. And he won't even be out of breath." With one last jostle to Kin's shoulders, PC released him. "Right. Well, that's enough from me. You will always have a place in my home." And with that, PC strode over to help several of the women pack up food and cart it out to their wagons. Kin stood at the front of the church, watching the hustle and bustle. In the back corner, Mrs. Griffin and Mrs. Callahan laughed together over something. Doc and the sheriff seemed taken with baby Ellery. The marshal and Mrs. Holloway stood near them, speaking to Bill Giddens. Wash and his brothers were busy carting pots and pans from the tables to wagons outside. Zoe stood in the midst of it all, directing and organizing. Beside him, someone cleared her throat softly. He glanced down and smiled. "Hi, Bill." She gave a little dip of her knees. "Just wanted to say that I wish you all the best on your venture." "Thank you." He studied her for a moment. "Are you ever going to follow your dream of going to the Territorial University to study art?" She shrugged one shoulder. "Maybe someday. It's just not the right time yet." Ken bumped her with his shoulder. "Just make sure there is a right time at some point. You have a talent like none I've ever seen." She blushed prettily. "Thank you." She lifted her gaze to his then. "Goodbye, Ken." "Goodbye, Bill." And as she walked away to join her family, a gaping emptiness filled him. Everyone had someone, it seemed, except him. Blazes, but he had a thirst coming on. But after Ewan's earlier snide remark, he was just stubborn enough to refuse to drink in his alehouse tonight. Besides, he was hankering for a ride. Who knew how long it would be before he got to ride again? Clay Elm, then. He'd ride to the Clay Elm Inn. It was a long ride, but cutting through the hills shaved off a lot of the time. And if he stayed up all night, then when he got on that train tomorrow, he could sleep all the way to Seattle and not have to think about all that he was leaving behind. And wasn't that just a contradiction? He'd just been thinking he had no one here. Yet now, he was thinking of all he'd be leaving behind. Chapter 8. Cora Harrison wearily stepped from the stage in Clay Elm and glanced the length of the worn gray boardwalk. Some Christmas this had turned out to be. She rolled her neck and hunched into her shawl in an attempt to ward off the damp chill of a clinging fog. "This is as far as we go tonight," the coachman barked gruffly. "We'll continue tomorrow morning. Be here at 10 o'clock right sharp. That ought to give me time to get the wheel repaired." Cora dropped her head to study the damp boards near her feet. The coach was supposed to have made it to the town of Wyldhaven today. She hoped her aunt wouldn't worry too much. Had she even gotten the message that she was now Cora's only living relative, and she was on her way to live with her? Early in the afternoon, the coach's wheel had fallen into what the coachman had called an axle breaker. The large hole in the road had been filled with water, and thus had its depth disguised. In their case, it hadn't broken the axle, but the wheel, which was nearly as bad. It had taken the coachman the better part of the day to cobble together a repair that had gotten them this far, but now it was late, and... She glanced into the shadows of the moonlit street again. Her very last penny had gone to buying her coach ticket. Where was she going to spend the night? Her valise landed with a thud near her feet. The coachman touched the brim of his hat. "Clay Elm Inn is just there, miss. Don't be late come morning." "I won't be." She dipped a nod of thanks and, even though she wanted to run after him and beg him for his help, watched him tromp down the street, leading the horses and coach to the livery. Her stomach rumbled loudly. She hadn't eaten since the apple and chunk of cheese that had served as her noon meal the day before. She'd counted on making it to her aunt's this evening. Now... How much longer until she would get to eat? Just the thought of food made her realize how hungry she was. Perhaps the innkeeper would grant her a tumbler of water. Then she needed to find the leeward side of a building, or perhaps a lean-to bunk in. It would be a long, cold, and sleepless night, but she'd survived them before. Hefting her valise, she walked to the door of the inn and pushed it open. Loud, bawdy music greeted her, along with a room filled with rowdy patrons and several buxom women making the rounds of the tables. Though they carried trays, it soon became apparent that food and drink were not all they offered. One woman plopped herself down into the lap of a man and draped her arms about his neck, whispering something into his ear. Cora's face heated, and she focused on the floorboards, even as she heard the bearded man laugh uproariously at whatever the barmaid had just said. This was no inn. It was a saloon. How did she get herself into these situations? Why would the coachman have sent her here? She might be penniless, but she was still a lady. Maybe there was a city pump where she could quench her thirst. She turned in haste to retreat. A hand shot out and clamped onto her arm.
Well, hello there. I ain't seen you around these parts afore.
The man's bloodshot eyes traveled a leisurely sweep the length of her, one corner of his mouth tipping into a sloppy grin.
I surely remember the likes of you.
If you'll pardon me, sir, I was just leaving. Cora tugged for the release of her arm. Her heart pounded against her breastbone. Oh, Lord of mercy, if ever I needed an angel of rescue, this would be the time.
Oh, come on.
The man's grip was like an iron band when he tugged her toward an empty table.
Just one drink. You can't say no to that?
Cora leaned back and dug in her heels. Her valise, which she mercifully maintained her grip on, bumped the chairs of several patrons who glowered at the intrusion. She didn't care how hungry or thirsty she was. She wasn't going to encourage this lecher by agreeing to his demands.
I must insist that you release me at once.
Cora's humiliation surged when she realized that her raised voice had cut through most of the room's other conversations. Almost every eye in the place fixed on her predicament, and silence fell. Her captor mimicked her.
I must insist that you release me at once.
He laughed heartily, pounding his free fist on the table he'd dragged her to. His grip momentarily slackened, and Cora wrenched her wrist hard in an attempt at escape. She almost succeeded, but at the last moment the man's hold tightened. Pain shot up Cora's arm and she whimpered. Her pulse thrummed in her ears. Bursts of breath beat against her teeth. The room lay so silent now that Cora heard a floorboard creak from somewhere behind her.
I suggest you let the lady loose.
The words, spoken by a man, emerged so quietly, so casually, and yet were such a welcome sound that Cora almost could have thought she'd dreamed them. Her eyes fell closed in relief. Her captor scoffed. He leaned slightly so he could peer behind her.
Mind your own business, Davis. We're just having a little fun.
You're drunk, Finn, and the lady isn't having fun. Let her go. This time, though the tone had not changed, his words were accompanied not only by the creaking floorboard, but also by the ratcheting of a gun hammer being pulled back. Eyes widening, Cora craned a glance over her shoulder to see if she might catch a glimpse of her rescuer, but could only see the shadow of a man before a bright lantern that hung just behind his head. The barrel of his gun glinted in the glow. Her captor grudgingly tossed her wrist back at her.
Since when do you carry a gun?
I guess the only thing that matters to you is that I do. Her rescuer's tone was still low and casual.
Bah!
The man called Finn stomped from the premises. Cora would have made her escape then, too, except she had no desire to follow her captor outside. She rubbed her wrist and spun to face the shadow man at the bar. Conversations in the room slowly resumed, though many still watched her. Her rescuer holstered his gun and sank onto the bar stool he'd apparently vacated when he'd stood up for her. He didn't give her so much as another glance. Cora lifted her chin and strode toward him. The least she could do was offer her thanks. She clutched her valise before her in a two-handed grip. Her hands twisted around and around the handle, for now that she stood next to him, she wasn't quite sure what to say. After a long moment, he turned on his stool, pushed his black Stetson back with one finger, and looked up at her. As the glow from the lantern fell over his face, she was surprised to note that he was much younger than she'd first thought. Maybe just a couple years older than her 17. The light revealed coal-black hair and eyes almost as dark. The face, broad across prominent cheekbones, might have been nice to look at if his eyes weren't so flinty. Stubble darkened a hard, angular jaw, which currently worked back and forth in obvious irritation at her blatant and prolonged scrutiny. Feeling the heat that filled her cheeks, she forced her focus to the edge of the bar. I must thank you. Her dry throat caught up to her, and the words emerged with barely any volume. The man continued to assess her, maintaining his silence. She cleared her throat and tried again. I must thank you, sir. Apparently done examining her, he resettled his hat and turned back to his drink. Think nothing of it, ma'am. A dismissal, if ever she'd heard one. It's miss, and it wasn't nothing. Uncertain where to go from here, she glanced around. Her gaze landed on the barmaid wiping up after a departing customer down the bar. The woman watched her curiously, though her rag moved with purpose. Might I trouble you for a glass of water? The woman pursed her ruby lips. Water's free with a meal, but when you only want water, it's 2 penny. Cora's hopes deflated, and as though to pile high her humiliation, just the mention of a meal sent a loud rumble through her stomach. Thanks all the same. Her feet dragged toward the door. Would her assailant be far enough away that she could exit unnoticed now? Behind her, a coin snapped onto the bar. Meal's on me, miss. Cora spun to face the man. 'Tis most kind of you, but I'll be fine. Thank you. Just then, one of the barmaids breezed past her, carrying a tray of bowls filled with a fragrant, thick meat stew. Large slices of cornbread accompanied each. Cora's mouth watered. She licked her lips. Curse her self-reliant pride. The man kicked out the bar stool next to him and snapped his fingers at the woman behind the counter. Stew and cornbread for the lady, Adele, and a glass of... He assessed Cora with a gaze that took her in from head to toe, and then his lips tipped up at the corners as he turned back to his stein. Water. The barmaid ladled a bowl of the stew and set it on the bar, adding the bread and water. Still, Cora hesitated. Her rescuer glanced at her over his shoulder. Unlike Finn, he gave a meaningful tip of his head toward the street outside. I promise not to bite. Her pulse spiked at just the mention of that vile man, and she instinctively retreated a step from the exit. Her rescuer, what had Finn called him, scrubbed a knuckle over his mouth. She might have thought he was hiding a smirk, if not for the fact that his eyes remained serious. He again nudged the bar stool with the toe of his boot. Safest seat in the house. Cora's stomach rumbled pleadingly. Very well, but she would repay the man just as soon as she was able. She crossed the room and climbed onto the stool. Depositing her valise on the warped floorboards, she threaded one ankle through the handle, a trick she had learned from her dear-departed mother to prevent the loss of valuables, and then bowed her head and closed her eyes to say grace. Beside her, she heard the man give a soft snort. No matter. She took her time with her prayer, thanking the good Lord for bringing her safely this far, and even for providing a kind stranger to supply food and drink when she was in need. Lastly, she asked the Lord to see her safely through the night and on to her aunt in the morning. When she lifted her head and reached for her glass, the man was still staring at her. I'd be most obliged for your name, sir, so that I might repay you for this kindness when I have the means. She drank a few slow sips, relishing the cool spread of the water over her parched tongue. Name's Davis, Ken Davis, and there's no need. I've been helped out of a difficult situation a time or two myself. Nevertheless, is this inn a good place to find you in the future, Mr. Davis? Lifting her spoon, she blew on a bite of the stew, willing herself not to gulp it down like a starved dog. He shrugged and raised his mug, sipping a slow draught before smacking his lips. Not likely. You've caught me on my last day in this area. Like I said, no need to concern yourself with it. The thick stew tasted just as good as it smelled, and she savored the flavors dancing in her mouth. Very well. I understand if you don't want to tell me where you live. I will simply trust the good Lord to orchestrate that we meet again at a time when it will benefit you most. He snorted. It'll be a cold day in... Well, I'll just say that I doubt the Lord deigns to even glance my way, miss. She searched his face.
I'm sorry you feel that way, for it couldn't be further from the truth. Perhaps in repayment for this meal, you'll allow me to pray for you over the coming months that God will reveal his love for you. He huffed and murmured, I just can't get away from it today. You can't get away from the Lord's love any day. No, I meant... Never mind. He looked down and spun his stein on the bar. Cora frowned. How could a man be so kind and yet so hard at the same time? Lord, perhaps you sent me to this saloon just to reach this man. If so, help me to know what to say. Love him. Cora dropped her spoon. It landed awkwardly on the rim of the bowl and then slipped off the bar, flinging a big spoonful of stew against Mr. Davis's shoulder and across his chest. Cora's cheeks blazed. Heavens! Surely her hunger had her hearing things. I'm so sorry. She had no napkin, so she reached out and swiped at the stew on his shoulder with just her hand. I've gone and ruined your shirt. She reached for the piece of potato that was slowly slinking its way down his vest. Mr. Davis grabbed her wrist. He glanced from her hand to her, one brow arching, and she realized that if she'd tried to grab that potato, she would only have ended up smearing more soup on him. Something in the way his gaze lingered on her face made her freeze. Her heart beat a tattoo. Was she about to experience his wrath? Only a moment later, one corner of his mouth tilted. Adele, can we get a damp rag here, please? Anything for you, sugar. Adele approached and handed the rag to Mr. Davis, while she leveled Cora with a possessive glower. Did the man have a relationship with the barmaid? If so, he didn't seem to be paying her much mind. He handed the rag to Cora. For your hand. She quickly wiped the sticky mess from her fingers, and then folded the soiled area to the inside and turned to wipe his shoulder. Once more he stopped her. I'll do it. He took the rag. She brushed her hands together to dispel the moisture. I'd be happy to wash those for you. He smirked and leveled her with a look. For you to do that, I'd have to take them off. Another wave of heat swept through her face. She looked down, focusing on a circle of carrot floating in her bowl, and trying not to focus on his impertinent challenge. Love him? Not a chance. She wanted a good and godly man when she did choose to fall in love. Surely she must have been hearing things. Please, God, tell me I was hearing things. Silence was her only answer. Can we get another spoon for the lady? At the back edge of the bar, Mr. Davis set a spoon on top of the rag he'd finished using, and Cora realized he'd stooped to pick her dirty one from the floor while she was trying to banish imaginings of what he might look like with his shirt off. With pinched lips, Adele snapped a spoon before her, and Cora murmured her thanks. She set to eating quietly after that, praying all the while that the Lord would deliver her from the sins of her flesh. Cora broke a chunk off her cornbread and popped it into her mouth. Mr. Davis had not asked for her name, and it really was quite improper for her to even be chatting with him, much less falling in love with him, when they hadn't been properly introduced. She glanced around the raucous interior. This whole incident was really rather unfitting. She would just finish her meal and then try to quietly find a place to sleep. Hopefully her aunt wouldn't learn of this impropriety forced by her circumstances and think less of her because of it. Adele took Mr. Davis's empty mug and slid a full one toward him. He held up a hand. No thanks. No more tonight. He folded his hands on the bar. Adele glowered at Cora like it might be her fault that the man wasn't spending his money, then snatched up the full mug and sashayed down the bar to foist it on some other poor soul. Cora finished her water and glanced sideways at the man. Shoulders slumped and head bowed, he looked like he carried the weight of the world. He was rugged and worldly, and from the look Adele had just given her, he likely drank more than he ought to, and often. He was nothing like any of the men who'd attracted her before. Actually, there had only been one, James Bench. His blonde hair was always slicked back with pomade, his chin always clean-shaven,
his hands soft from days spent in the library studying. He was a church-going man who never missed a service, and she might have married him if his head hadn't been turned by Millie LaBelle. She cast another sideways glance at Mr. Davis. Had the man ever darkened the door of a church? It was the fact that he'd rescued her, that's what. She couldn't imagine what else it could be. She could never be so frivolous as to fall in love with a man only moments after meeting him. Fall in love? Ridiculous. That did it. She plunked her spoon into her empty bowl. "Thank you for the meal, Mr. Davis. I'll pray the Lord blesses you for your kindness and generosity. Don't discount his love for you." The look he leveled on her was filled with weariness. "A real missionary you are, huh?" She stood and gathered her satchel. "I suppose you mean that as an insult, but I can only take it as a compliment. The Bible teaches us to go into all the world and preach the gospel. I try to do that whenever I can." She gave a little curtsy. "I bid you good night, sir." She started to the door, feeling his gaze drilling into her back. "The only place with rooms to let around here is this one," he called. She paused and turned to face him, clasping her hands together. He'd spun on his stool and now faced her, elbows propped behind him on the bar. "Yes, I understood as much from the coachman. Thanks again." She rushed out then, before he could try to stop her once more. Chapter 9. Kin swept a hand down his face as the beautiful blonde hurried out. She'd obviously arrived in town on the stagecoach. He'd seen it pulling up the street as he stepped into the inn. Only a few minutes later she had entered. So where did she think she was going to sleep? It hit him then. She'd been about to leave earlier when Adele told her she had to pay for the water. She didn't have any money. He had to go after her. He dropped a coin on the bar to pay for his drink. Adele eyed it and then leaned across the bar, blinking up at him provocatively. "Only one tonight? You're just getting started, honey. We could take a bottle and go upstairs if you like." It wasn't the first time Adele had given him such a blatant invitation. He tugged at the brim of his hat. "Good night, Adele. Take care of yourself." With that, he pulled both the sheepskin coat that the Holloways had given him and his long duster from their pegs by the door and hurried out onto the boardwalk as he swung them on. The blonde woman was just disappearing into one of the alleys down the street. He hadn't even gotten her name. He should have asked when she requested his. He would fix that blunder as soon as he caught up to her. When he hurried into the alley, he saw her settling onto a crate about halfway down. She tugged her thin coat tightly about her. At that moment, the clouds parted, and a shaft of moonlight bathed her in its rays. It caught in her upswept gold hair and stroked her high cheekbones as though it too wondered how soft her skin might feel. He shook away the sentimental feeling. Whoever she was simply passing through, and he was headed out on the morning train. At the sound of his footsteps, her head snapped up and her eyes widened. She leapt to her feet, studying him warily. He lifted his palms. "I don't mean you any harm. Surely you can't mean to sleep out here all night." She glanced down, rolling a pebble beneath the toe of her boot. "I'm afraid I don't have any other choice. The coach was supposed to bring me all the way to Wyldhaven today, but we had a bit of bad luck and the wheel broke, so we had to stop here for the night." Wyldhaven? The word hit him like a punch. This beauty was coming to Wyldhaven? "Yes. My aunt lives there. She's married to a banker." "Mrs. Olan is your aunt?" She lifted wide eyes. "She is. Do you know her? Is she well? How was the baby? I sent her a letter before I left the city, but of course I haven't gotten a response while traveling." Ken stretched out a hand. "I never caught your name." She hesitated a moment, but then must have decided to trust him because her slender, cool palm settled against his. And hang it, if his heart wasn't suddenly beating just as fast as it had when he took her hand back in the inn. "My name is Cora Harrison." He gave her hand a pump and then dropped it like a hot potato. "Nice to meet you, Cora. And to answer your questions, yes, I know your aunt. Not well. They've only lived in town for a short time, but the whole family is well." Her smile was like the first warm day after a long winter.
"Oh, that's wonderful. I'm so relieved to hear it. I wasn't certain if I was going to come all this way only to find that they had moved."
Kin shoved his hands deep into the pockets of his duster, where he could ensure they would behave themselves. And then, when she huddled into her shoulders and gave a little shiver, he immediately realized he had on 2 coats while she had only one thin one. He yanked off his duster and then the sheepskin coat beneath it. This he held out to her. She shook her head.
"Oh, I couldn't."
He gave the jacket a little shake.
"I insist. Let's get your stuff and I'll give you a ride to Wyldhaven. It's only about an hour and a half from here if we cut through the hills."
When she still didn't move to take the jacket, he stepped toward her and swung it around her shoulders, and for a moment he stood there face to face with her. She was tiny, only about as tall as his chin and engulfed in the coat. The only thing big about her seemed to be those wide, searching eyes. Swallowing, he stepped back.
"See, isn't that better?"
He thrust his arms into his duster. She worked to don the coat properly and gave a little nod as she threaded the buttons.
"Very warm. It appears I'm once again in your debt, Mr. Davis."
The formality grated.
"How about we dispense with propriety and you call me Kin, Cora?"
She blinked at him.
"I'm not sure we should—"
"Are the rest of your things on the stage?" he interrupted before she could finish her protest. Clay Elm streets were no place for any woman in the night, much less a lady like this one.
No." She gestured to the bag at her feet. "This is all there is."
"All the better." He nudged her to precede him toward the livery. "My horse will already be carrying 2, so the less baggage, the better." Cora snagged up her valise and trotted to keep up with him. He consciously shortened his stride.
"Mr. Davis, I'm not certain I should agree to ride through these wilderness hills with a man I barely know, and unchaperoned at that."
He gritted his teeth. She had no idea what danger she'd be putting herself in by trying to sleep on the streets of Clay Elm.
"You were planning to stay unchaperoned on the street tonight."
"Well, that's different." Different indeed. He slid the barn door open enough for them to pass through, and then pushed it shut behind them. His horse whickered to him from down the aisle. "I promise you'll be safer with me. Besides which," he flashed her his best smile, "I also promise to be on my best behavior." She eyed him warily. He raised a hand. "In all seriousness, my only aim is to escort you safely to your aunt's." She must have believed him that time, because she looked away and said,
"You're very kind, Mr. Davis. It's just that my aunt, she can be a bit—"
"I was raised by a pastor." She was silent for a moment.
"What?"
Kin hefted his saddle and blanket from the rack and strode down to the stall his horse was in. "The man who raised me after my pa passed away. He's a pastor." If anything would get her to trust him, that might. She remained silent. He glanced at her as he worked to tighten the cinch. She had her head bowed and seemed to be praying by the way her lips were moving. He rolled his eyes. He wasn't that scary. He waited until she lifted her head before he said, "Just think, in 2 hours you'll be in a warm bed instead of trying to doze in that grimy alley."
"I'm just not certain you understand my aunt."
He frowned. The woman surely couldn't begrudge him for plucking her niece from the dangerous streets of Clay Elm and escorting her safely to her door. With the horse saddled, he held out a hand to help her mount. "Everything will be fine. You ever ridden before?" She studied his horse cautiously.
"I grew up in New York."
He smirked. "So I'll take that as a no. No matter." He assessed her skirts. "Your dress looks wide enough. I'll swing you up, and you straddle the horse with one leg on each side. You just have to keep your balance until I lead you outside, and then I'll swing up behind you. After that, all you have to do is hang on. Set your bag down for a moment." She did, but when he settled his hands around her waist, she gave a little squeak and leapt back.
"What are you doing?"
"Easy there, missionary. I did tell you I'd need to swing you on board, you'll recall."
"Oh, yes. Sorry."
He grasped her waist again, and this time she worked with him as he swung her up into the saddle. But as she swung her leg over the horse, there came a sound of ripping material. She gasped and looked down at her skirt on the other side of the horse. He rounded to examine it himself. "It's just the seam. Sorry about that. I guess I need more practice at judging the width of a woman's skirts." She pressed her lips into a thin line as she accepted her bag from him. "A man like you surely has plenty of practice." She gasped at her own impertinence. "I'm sorry. I don't know whatever made me say that." He grinned, liking her more for the spark of gumption. "So, the missionary has a little bite. I'll be sure to remember that. But for your information," he slid the barn door open, led her outside, and then shut the door behind him, "I'm not a rake." He swung up behind her and reached around her to take the reins. She pulled in a little breath and stiffened. "Adele didn't seem to think that was the case." Ken huffed. "It's Adele's job to ignore every standoffish signal a man gives her." He grinned then. "You weren't feeling a little jealous, now were you?" She gasped. "Certainly not." Ken couldn't suppress a little chuckle. He definitely hadn't ever looked forward to a long ride through a freezing night more than he was looking forward to this one. Chapter 10. The ride home was uneventful, but it was late when they arrived and knocked on the Olins' front door. Weary as he was, Ken was thankful that the Olins lived in town in a house they'd built right next door to the Holloways behind the bank. It would only take him 5 minutes to get to his bed from here. Fun as his teasing of Cora had been at the front end of the trip, he'd grown weary, and his mind was now focused on tomorrow's train ride to Seattle. The encounter with the beautiful Cora had made him realize something. He was ready for this. He didn't have to become the man his pa had been. He could choose kindness and self-sacrifice, and he would. It would be his way of honoring PC for all he'd done for him, even if he still wasn't sure about his religious views. Mr. Olin answered the door in pajamas and a nightcap. Clutching her valise before her, Cora gave a little curtsy. "Good evening, Uncle." She explained who she was. Ken frowned. Had she ever met her aunt and uncle before? Cora went on to tell of the situation she'd found herself in, ending with a gesture in Ken's direction. "Mr. Davis was kind enough to escort me here from Clay Elm." Mr. Olin frowned and consulted a pocket watch. "At this time of night?" "Yes. I didn't have any money for a room, you see, and he was concerned for my safety if I stayed on the streets." Mr. Olin squinted at Ken for a moment before finally stepping back to pull the door a little wider. "Very well. Come in. My wife is already abed, as you can imagine, but we'll get all this straightened out in the morning." Cora dipped Ken a parting curtsy. "Good night and Godspeed, Mr. Davis." Ken tipped his hat. As he walked away, he couldn't withhold a grin. He shook his head. The little missionary and PC would get along just fine, he suspected. It was a bit strange to enter the parsonage through the front door at this time of night. Normally, when he was drunk and coming home this late, he went through his window to avoid a confrontation with PC. But tonight, it wouldn't have mattered. The house was dark and quiet. Only Allegra padded across the room to wriggle a welcome home greeting. Tommy snored softly from his bed across the room as Ken fell onto his own mattress, settled Allegra into a mound of bedding at the foot of his bed, and tugged the covers over his shoulders. For the first time in many days, he slept without restlessness. And when a loud knock cracked against the front door the next morning, he sat up feeling like a new man. He nudged Allegra from his bed and checked the clock on the nightstand. Still 2 hours before he needed to be at the train station. His bags were already packed, so he could lounge here for a few moments longer. Whoever was at the door likely wanted PC to come to one of the camps to pray over a sick loved one, or maybe to officiate a funeral. Remembering how conversation with Cora the night before had flowed like they were old friends, after she'd finally realized he meant her no harm and had relaxed a little, he pulled in a long, satisfied inhale. If he were honest, a gal like her could almost make a man wish he were staying in town, but her arrival had come too late. Still, maybe he'd be returning to Wyldhaven sooner than he'd first thought. He grinned and swung his feet over the side of the bed. Tommy was already sitting up, watching him.
You look happy.
I am happy, Tom. For the first time in a long time, actually. In the front room, Kin heard PC answer the door. Whoever was at the door sounded a bit agitated, but Kin couldn't make out what exactly was being said. He tugged on his pants and cocked his head to listen, but things seemed to have gone silent now. He was just slipping on his shirt when a knock sounded on the bedroom door. Kin, could you join me out here a moment? Kin sighed as he finished the front buttons. Coming. Was it someone else here to say goodbye? Had there been someone who couldn't attend yesterday's shindig? He strode into the main room, feet bare, and still concentrating on doing up the buttons of his cuffs. A woman gasped. He paused and glanced up, his brows lifted. Mrs. Olin, what was she doing here? Finished with the cuff buttons, he offered PC a quizzical look. PC thinned his lips and swung a hand to indicate he should greet the woman. He hefted Allegra and moved to tie her out on the porch. Good morning, Mrs. Olin. How may I help you? She still didn't face him. Are you presentable now? Kin glanced the length of himself and made a quick job of tucking in his shirt. Yes, ma'am. She faced him. A scathing look skimmed him from head to toe. When her eyes landed on his bare feet, her lips pinched into a tight little pooch. Her focus rebounded to his face. You're going to have to marry her. For the longest moment, Kin remained stock still. Whatever was she talking about? And then, like a bucket of ice water, it dawned on him. Excuse me? PC stepped forward. Mrs. Olin seems to think there was some sort of impropriety between you and her niece last night. Kin's jaw ached. There most certainly was not. I found Cora in distress in Clay Elm, without a penny for food or drink. I bought her a meal. She planned to sleep on the street since she didn't have any money for a room. When I found out she was Mrs. Olin's niece, I told her I would bring her home, which I did. He transferred his narrowed gaze to the woman before him, without touching her, well, other than to ride with her on the horse. Mrs. Olin gasped. You rode on the same horse? Kin bit his tongue and willed himself to remember that he'd woken up in a good mood. Yes, ma'am. There was only the one. Mrs. Olin turned her gaze on PC. They arrived at nearly 12 in the morning, and my dear Cora had a rip in her skirt. That happened when I helped her up on the horse. Kin tossed one hand in the air. Mrs. Olin lifted her chin a little higher. She said you'd been drinking, which I know you've a reputation for. Perhaps you don't remember what happened. Kin thrust his hands into his pockets so he couldn't follow through on the temptation to take her arm and show her the door. He pulled in a slow, measured breath before allowing himself to speak. He made his case to PC. I had one beer. One. I remember everything, and I didn't touch her. Ask the girl, she'll tell you. Lips pinched, Mrs. Olin hummed. Yes, I did ask her. She has told me exactly what you've said. It sounds to me like you both planned how to present the story. Kin opened his mouth, but when PC stepped forward with one finger raised, snapped it shut again. Ma'am, Kin didn't touch your niece. I'd stake my life on it. Kin felt his shoulders relax a little. At least someone believed him. And at least Cora had spoken the truth. She had tried to warn him the night before about her aunt. Perhaps he should have listened more carefully. But even then, he wouldn't have been able to leave her stranded in Clay Elm with no safe place to stay. I thought you to be a man of the cloth. Mrs. Olin snapped at PC. For the first time, Kin saw PC's jaw bulge. I am a man of the cloth, ma'am. Then I insist that you back me up in fending for the reputation of my niece. Kin roughed a hand through his hair. Have you even met your niece before this morning? The woman's eyes glittered. Whether or not I've met her before makes not one whit of difference. I've just learned this morning that it's my burdensome responsibility to care for her, and all in the same breath that she spent half the night gallivanting and who knows what with you through the back country, unchaperoned. She angled a glance toward the door. Cora, do come in now. Cora stepped timidly through the portal, hands curled together in a manner that revealed her distress. Her red-rimmed eyes sought him out. I'm so sorry, she mouthed. Come, Mrs. Olin snapped, wagging a hand at her niece. And do speak with your voice if you have something to communicate. It's improper to murmur and mumble. Mrs. Olin wrapped one arm around Cora's shoulders, but the gesture looked more like it was meant to trap the girl there than to comfort her. Cora's gaze was still fixed to his. Her eyes revealed more than he'd ever considered possible. She was sorry that her aunt was throwing such a fit. She didn't want him to have to marry her, but at the same time she dreaded the days ahead of living with such a woman. Kin gripped the back of his neck and studied the floor. He couldn't marry her. She was practically a stranger, no matter that the night before he'd admired her spunk and unapologetic belief in her God. I'd like to speak to Cora alone. Mrs. Olin gasped. She looked at PC. There, you see? Such unseemliness. PC's lips thinned. I'm not sure how things were done where you were from, Mrs. Olin. He stepped forward and took the woman's arm, tugging her rather forcefully toward the kitchen table on the other side of the main room. But here in the West, a man is allowed to be a gentleman without having his motives questioned. Well, I never! The woman sputtered and kept glancing over her shoulder to look at them. Kin tipped a nod toward the opposite wall. We can talk over here. Tommy chose that moment to poke his head out of their bedroom. Kin, can I come out now? Sure, pal. This is Cora. Tommy smiled shyly at the pretty blonde. Hi. Cora, this is Tommy. Cora stretched out a hand. It's a pleasure to meet you, Tommy. Kin touched Tommy on the shoulder. See that woman in the poofy hat talking to PC? Tommy nodded. She's Cora's aunt. I bet if you asked her, she'd be happy to make your oatmeal this morning. Tommy's eyes sparkled, and he jumped up and down a couple times. Maybe she makes it nice and sweet like Aurora. Kin nodded. I bet she would if you ask her. Tommy skipped toward PC and Mrs. Olin, and Kin couldn't withhold a grin. When he glanced back at Cora, she gave him a knowing look. You're terrible. He smiled. Maybe. Figured it might give us more time to talk. Tears immediately burgeoned in her eyes. I'm so sorry she's doing this. My mother told me about her, but I'd never met her until this morning. Cora's gaze sought the woman out, where she was being prodded toward the kitchen by an enthusiastically bouncing Tommy. From the kitchen table, PC offered Kin a knowing grin. Kin had halfway wondered if the parson would bail the woman out and make Tommy's morning food ritual himself, but it looked like he was on board with Kin's plan. Cora glanced down at her hands. Oh, she practically had an apoplectic fit when her husband mentioned me to her this morning. I could hear her yelling all the way in my room down the hall. I don't think she's happy about having another mouth to feed. It was all starting to make sense now. So, she's trying to foist you off on me. He immediately recognized the mistake in those words when her tears spilled over to stream down her cheeks. Not that I would see it as foisting. Of course you would. Cora picked at one fingernail. And I can't marry you. You're not the kind of man I want. He pushed away the discomfort her words raised. Hey, chin up. Kin crooked one finger gently beneath her chin, bending down until she met his gaze. We're not going to let her force us to get married for something we didn't do, simply because she doesn't want to take care of you. But what were they going to do? That was the question. He frowned. Didn't you write her before you came? I did, but my mother passed, and our landlord told me I had till the next day to get out. I mailed the letter before I left New York, but she shrugged. I must have beat it here. Kin's heart went out to her. So, your mother passed the day before you left New York? She nodded. 3 weeks and 2 days ago. Kin's eyes fell closed. And right before Christmas, too. He thought quickly. If her snooty aunt didn't want her, he certainly wasn't going to leave this sweet girl living with a stranger. Did Leora and Joe have room? He thought of his departure time that was getting closer by the minute. He didn't really have time to take her out there, but he knew PC would be happy to escort her. Tell me what your skills are? She shrugged. I was a maid in a hotel before I left New York. I can cook a fair bit. Other than that, not much. A maid. Kin snapped his fingers. I've just the place for you. He grinned. And you're gonna love it. Just let me get my stuff and put some shoes on. She swiped her cheeks and nodded. Kin emerged a few moments later with all his things and stretched an arm for her to precede him. PC looked at him quizzically. Kin wagged his head and kept his voice down. Neither one of us want to get married, and we didn't do anything wrong. I believe you. Dixie told me just yesterday morning that she wished she had a housekeeper to clean the boarding house rooms now that she's so busy being a mother. It comes with a room. Cora seems to think that Mrs. Olin simply doesn't want the bother of supplying for her. In the doorway from the kitchen, Mrs. Olin gasped. Her narrowed gaze landed on Cora. How could you say such a thing? But Kin wasn't about to let the woman keep bullying Cora. He placed one hand to Cora's back. Because she heard what you said to your husband this morning. But don't worry, I have the perfect job for Cora. You won't have to give her a cent. With that, he reached past Cora and tugged open the door. PC was there then, arms outstretched for a last hug. You're sure you don't want me to ride with you to the station? Or take Cora to the boarding house myself? Kin swallowed as the man's arms enveloped him. Nah, you got Tommy to think of. And Wash and Zoe are going to see me off. And I have plenty of time to introduce Cora to Mrs. Griffin before we leave. His throat threatened to close off, but he forced the next words past the restriction. Thanks for everything. PC clapped him firmly on the back. I'm proud of your actions last night, son. Real proud. Kin only nodded, unable to look the man in the eye. He motioned to Tommy. Get over here, Tom, and give me a farewell hug. Tommy looked bewildered. Farewell? Yeah, pal. But maybe not for as long as I first thought. PC's gaze drifted knowingly to Cora. Kin realized that perhaps he'd revealed too much with that comment. He stretched out one arm to pull Tommy in for an embrace. Tommy come? Nah. Kin ruffled his hair. You gotta stay here and make sure PC eats right. Tommy straightened a little. Okay. PC rolled his eyes and mouthed, thanks. Kin grinned, knowing that Tommy would hound PC from this moment forward about whether he was eating right. He lifted a hand of farewell, then closed the door quickly before his emotions got the better of him. He directed Cora to the boarding house and was thankful that Mrs. Griffin's face lit up like a candlelit Christmas tree the moment he presented Cora and her experience. Of course I have a job for you. Do you have a place to stay? The job comes with room and board. Cora blew out a breath of relief. Oh, thank you, Mom. That would be very helpful. Mrs. Griffin grinned and flapped her hands. Oh, I'm just thrilled to pieces. Stay right here, and I'll go get the agreement for you to sign. Then I can show you around. How soon can you start? Today? Mrs. Griffin gave a little cheer. Oh, Ken, you are a lifesaver. And goodbye again, by the way. I know you probably need to get going. I just saw Wash and Zoe walk by, heading to the livery. She pulled him in for a quick hug before she bustled off to find her paperwork. There was a soft look in Cora's eyes when she settled her gaze on him. You know, last night, when that man Finn took hold of me, I prayed for God to send me an angel of rescue. Only just now did I realize that he actually did. Kin adjusted his bag on his shoulder and couldn't withhold a chuckle. First time I've ever been called an angel. I'm just glad I was there to help. He swept his hat to where Mrs. Griffin had disappeared. Mrs. Griffin will take good care of you and be your friend to boot inside 24 hours. You'll find that most of the people in town are more like her than they are like your aunt. He motioned up the hill to the church they'd passed on the way here. There's even a real good church. I'm sure you'll like that. She nodded. I will. Goodbye, Mr. Davis. He backed toward the door.
Goodbye, Missionary Harrison.
She smiled. I'll pray for you. God truly does love you and see you. That's what Christmas was all about. Imagine the holy creator of all that we see, leaving his place in heaven to be born in a lowly manger. One day, God's love is going to wash over you so powerfully that you won't be able to understand how you resisted it for so long.
Kin gave her a friendly roll of his eyes. But as he rode on the wagon seat next to Wash and Zoe, doing his best to keep up his end of the conversation, he couldn't help but ponder on her parting words. Did God truly love a washout like him? Could he one day be a friend of God like PC had preached about?
We're here, Wash announced, pulling the team to a stop.
Why are you looking so pensive all of a sudden?
Kin waved a hand and hopped from the wagon, gathering his stuff while Wash helped Zoe down from the other side.
It's nothing. Thanks again for the ride.
Zoe flung her arms around his neck. Of course. We couldn't let our best pal from school days leave without one final goodbye.
Wash grinned and stretched out one thick palm.
Until we meet again, Kin.
Kin juggled his luggage to free up a hand. He nodded, and this time the restriction in his throat couldn't be overcome. So without another word, he hurried into the train station. But as the train chuffed away from Wyldhaven a few minutes later, Kin looked out the window and smiled. He would go to Seattle for a little while, but he'd be back. He'd definitely be back. And as the visage of a beautiful blonde with hazel eyes and upswept hair filled his mind, he knew that what he'd said to Tommy earlier was true. He'd likely be back sooner than imagined. This has been an unabridged production of Kin Davis's Christmas Send-Off by Lynnette Bonner. Copyright 2019 by Lynnette Bonner. Read by Amy Lilly. Directed and engineered by Adam Hassel at the Oasis Audio Studios. If you've enjoyed this audio production, please look for Songs in the Night, the 12th story in the Wyldhaven series. It can be found on Amazon, iTunes, and Audible.